For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bob Shrum, the director of the Center for the Political Future at USC Dornsife, and we love doing events with the Schwarzenegger Institute here at Price, which contributes so much to the life of this university intellectually and in terms of students getting in contact with the real world. I want to welcome everybody who's here, people who are on Zoom or Facebook, live or YouTube, or who may hear us on our podcast, Let's Find Common Ground. On behalf of the Center and the Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome Sir James Cleverly for today's conversation. He is a conservative member of Parliament for Braintree and has served in a wide range of ministerial roles, including as Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary. Mm-hmm. Today I will be asking you to share your perspective a lot on a divided and tense world, but I may sneak in a question or two that relates to Home Secretary.
Yeah, okay.
So thank you for being with us. Let me start with a general question. How would you assess the state and strength of NATO and of the Western Alliance?
Oh, yeah, start off with an easy one, Bob.
I said it was general, not easy.
Look, I'm an optimist. I was at the Reagan Presidential Library a couple of days ago, and I was quite struck by how he was an optimistic conservative, and I define myself as an optimistic conservative. So I think that some of the most important friendships and alliances will survive. I think NATO will survive. I think the relationship between the UK and the US and like-minded countries in Europe will survive. But I think they're being tested, and the kind of the lazy short answer is that they are being tested by the tone and the action that President Trump is taking. I think that is an oversimplification of the situation. I think they're being tested for a whole load of reasons. And I think that the president's kind of frustration and anger with some of these things is more a symptom of that testing rather than the cause of those testing times. So I'm an optimist. They're in a difficult place at the moment, but I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think, take NATO for example. I hold my hand up to this as a British conservative and until recently a minister of the government. We didn't spend as much on defense as we should have done, and we lent too heavily on the US. And the US allowed us to do this because we are long-standing friends, but you don't abuse friendships. We should have done more. We're now committed to doing more, and I'll press my Labour government to make good on those commitments. And I think if we do, that friendship will endure and we'll be in a good place.
Well, let me do a follow-up to that. When you think about NATO, the inter-alliance tensions we've been seeing, the president's complaints about the NATO countries not spending enough on defense, how do you react to President Macron when he echoes President de Gaulle's suggestion, in effect, that Europe has to have its own sufficient level of military force instead of depending heavily, and the German chancellor said this as well, instead of depending so heavily on the American nuclear umbrella?
So French presidents have got to do. That's the default message from a French president. French president has got to stand up and say, you know, France should be powerful enough on its own. France should be able to be the guardian of Europe. France, and when they say Europe, what they mean is France, with neighbouring countries. And I love the French. I mean, genuinely, I had a very good relationship with my French counterpart. We joked about the Anglo-French friction quite regularly. But from a French president, you have got to put across the France should stand on its own and we can stand on its own. But the simple truth, in the modern era, France has never stood completely on its own. The UK has never stood completely on its own. The US has never stood completely on its own. NATO allies came to the support of the United States of America after 9/11. It's the only time in world history Article 5 has been invoked, and it was invoked because it was the United States of America that was attacked, and NATO allies rallied to support. So the point is, we all need each other. I would love, as a British politician, to stand up and say, uniquely, Britain is the only European power that could stand alone in a turbulent world. But the fact is, none of us can stand alone, and that includes the US. And I make this point to my Republican friends. Isolationism always sounds like a good idea. It just doesn't work. And it's certainly not something that's been credible in the 20th century. And I don't think, even for a country as big and as resource rich and as talented and powerful as the US, I don't think isolationism is a credible option for the US, and it's certainly not a credible option for any European powers.
Well, historically, it would have been a catastrophe if the isolationists had prevailed in 1939, 40, 41, and the US had not aided Britain, because we soon would have been fighting the Nazis as they were trying to come across the Atlantic.
So my message now, and had I been around in that early era of the Second World War, it's the message that I would have said then. It's the message that I would have said at the beginning of the century, when America was questioning whether it should get involved with the Great War, the Great European War. And my message is, you can fight and win over there now, or you can let over there fall, meaning Europe, and then fight on your home turf. But you're going to have this fight. And that is as true then as it is now. And you're not necessarily asking specifically about Ukraine, but again, I keep making the point.
I was going to, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I make the point to my Republican friends and others when they say, look, Russia is a sideshow, Ukraine isn't the main event, China is the growing threat. And I say, I'm not disagreeing with your macro assessment, but what I would say is think what message you would be sending to Beijing if the US didn't stick by the commitments it made to Ukraine. Do we think we are collectively safer if we send the message that the most powerful nation in the world has got 2.5 years, 3 years worth of resolve? And if things drag on too long and it gets a bit too difficult, bearing in mind there have been no American military lives lost, that the American military expenditure in support of Ukraine is a tiny, tiny percentage of the overall US defense expenditure, do we really collectively want to say that if you're willing to fight for 3.5 years, then the most powerful nations on earth just we run out of steam? Because if we send that message, then we are going to have some very nasty conflicts in the near future. And I'm big on the peace through strength. Again, big slogan from the Reaganite era, but it's as true today as it was in the Cold War. And if we don't want British and American blood spilt, then we've got to make sure that Ukraine wins.
Okay, that raises two questions, and then I want to go back to something you said at
Sure.
the beginning. Is it reasonable to hope, you said Ukraine, we have to hope Ukraine wins. That does not seem to be where the American administration is. Is it reasonable to hope for a negotiated settlement, which is what the administration seems to prefer? What kind of settlement would that be? And to use your phrase, what light, if any, do you see at the end of this tunnel?
Okay, so I'll ask an open question to try and perhaps get American minds into the space of where the Ukrainians are. So I've met President Zelensky a number of times, both in Ukraine and in the UK. I've had a lot of dealings with the Ukrainians and with Eastern Europeans, both in the Baltic and Poland and Moldova and that whole arc, Romania, that whole arc of Eastern European countries. All conflicts end in negotiations. Some of them are very one-way negotiations, like the German capitulation at the end of the Second World War, but ultimately everything ends in negotiation. So the question asked is, what would be reasonable for the Ukrainian people to sacrifice? So if Alaska had been taken from the US by force, and I, as a British politician, pointed at a map and said, look, it's a long way away from mainland America. It's not even been America for that long. It's not really your country. And Hawaii, you should throw that into the deal as well. And Southern California, it's pretty Mexican. And maybe Florida, we should give that to the Cubans. You still get the big chunk in the middle. You still get to keep 80% of the land mass of your country. Cut a deal. I don't think I would make it to the door without being set upon by this audience. And I don't think that's a reasonable thing to ask a country to sacrifice, particularly if that country has fed its young men and women, and indeed not so young men and women, into the meat grinder for 2.5, 3.5 years to defend its sovereign territory. And so the question I ask is it reasonable for anyone to say to the Ukrainians who have fought and died for the sovereignty of their own nation, give up big chunks of your country, just do a deal? And even if you do think it's reasonable, your view, my view, the views in this room don't count because we're not Ukrainian. The views that count are the views of the Ukrainian people, and I've spoken to them. And when you have paraplegics in every city in Ukraine, people who have lost limbs, come back from the front line, they are not going to accept a deal which sees big chunks of their country given to a murdering, aggressive regime that have stolen their children. I don't know how much of this is reported in the US. In the eastern and southern oblasts, children are being stolen from their parents, are being sent into mainland Russia to be indoctrinated. I mean, we've seen these stories before, and it's happening in Eastern Europe in the here and now. And I don't think that kind of behavior should be rewarded, because if it is, all we're doing is storing up bigger problems for the near future. So is this going to ultimately end in negotiation? I suspect so, of some type. Do we want that negotiation to take place with Russia, with Putin on the front foot, dictating terms? Or do we want that negotiation to take place with Putin on the back foot and Zelensky presenting terms? For me, both the pragmatic and the moral argument is the same. We cannot have a state of affairs where aggressive murdering regimes can be seen internationally to have won. And I think that is a principle well worth defending.
And how do you react to the idea that as part of any settlement, the US and maybe some European countries as well have to give Ukraine an agreement similar to Article 5 of NATO, that if they're attacked, they will be defended?
I mean, you say that as if it's a new thing. I mean, there is already agreement. And this is the point I make about sticking to commitments that have been made. The Minsk agreement was explicit.
1993.
Yeah, 1993.
Signed by Bill Clinton, yeah.
Signed between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, with the UK and the US as guarantors. Right. And the deal was really simple. Ukraine had a residual nuclear weapons arsenal from its time as a Soviet, as a republic of the USSR. And the deal was really simple. Ukraine and Belarus give up their nuclear arsenals, and in return there is agreement that they will not be invaded either by Russia or by the West, and we were respective guarantors. So that's agreed. The US is a signatory to that, as is my country. And then Ukraine got invaded in contravention to the Minsk agreement, and we didn't enforce the Minsk agreement properly. And the message that Putin took from that is that these countries, the UK, the US, we've got the means, we've got the weapons, we've got the power, we haven't got the guts. And so he kept going further and further and further. And he genuinely thought, and I've seen the intelligence reports, and much of the intelligence reporting's in the public domain, so I don't think I'm giving too much away. He did not believe that we would stand up to him. Just as Hitler did not believe that the West would stand up to him. That's why he did what he did. That's why Putin did what he did, because he didn't think we had the guts to stand up to him. And so we've got to demonstrate we do have the guts. And like, it's always better to learn from your successes. Second best thing is to learn from your mistakes. And we made a mistake not enforcing the Minsk agreement. So let's not make that mistake again.
Why didn't we?
Because we were...
I mean, conservatives were in government.
Yeah.
And
I think we misread Putin's intentions, which is criminal, seeing as he was pretty explicit. I mean, to be fair to him, he didn't hide his intentions. I mean, he literally said that the greatest tragedy of the modern era was the collapse of the USSR, and he wanted to rebuild basically the Russian Empire by another name, and he said that. He wrote it down. He said it regularly, and we didn't listen, and we kind of thought he didn't really mean it. And it's one of the things that I think Western powers are quite good at is dealing with like sudden big events. It triggers us, we spring into action. What we are really bad at doing is dealing with kind of the boiling frog events. You know, we talk about the boiling frog. It's a brutal analogy. Rising tide, that's a better one. So something that gets gently and slowly, progressively worse, where there isn't an obvious starting point. And so this invasion of Ukraine started with disinformation. It started with sowing seeds of dissent in the eastern oblasts, in Crimea. It just started very gently. So you can't really put your finger on a particular time or date where the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. It kind of started very, very, very slowly and gently. So we didn't have a trigger event to respond to. And then the next thing we know, Crimea's being annexed. We kind of do a bit of hand-wringing and moaning and groaning in the United Nations in New York. We don't do anything very much. Then military vehicles come into eastern Ukraine. We moan. We don't do very much. And then it's only when the full-scale, obvious big invasion starts that we spring into action. But we should have dealt with it 5, 6 years or more earlier, when the creeping annexation started.
How strong is Putin's Russia? I mean, I think most people thought their troops would get to Kiev in 3 or 4 days.
Well, Putin certainly thought so.
Yeah.
He thought we know this now, and again, it's in the public domain. He thought that the Ukrainian people despised Zelensky. He thought the Ukrainian people would welcome a proper, strong leader. He thought that he would have to do almost no fighting. He thought the Ukrainian government and the structures of the Ukrainian state would collapse within days. And he thought he would be able to get right the way across Ukraine in a matter of a couple of weeks without having to do almost any fighting at all. There's footage, you can look at it on YouTube and other social media platforms, of Russian troops genuinely shocked because they're being shouted at and abused by little old Ukrainian ladies who are telling them off, saying, "What are you doing here? How dare you? What are your mothers thinking?" And like being told off. And these Russian soldiers thought they were going to be welcomed and have flowers given to them. But in the end, they got sworn at by little old ladies and shouted at, and they were genuinely shocked. What we now know is the Russian military was less prepared and more corrupt than people expected. Do you remember that big traffic jam on the road coming out of Belarus towards Kyiv, which all these broken vehicles? So I'm in the British military as a reservist. I'm in the Royal Artillery. We've got some pretty big vehicles, and one of the things you've got to do, particularly with wheeled vehicles, is you've got to move them pretty regularly. You've got to get the hydraulic fluids pumping around the system. You've got to get the brakes fluids pumping around the system. You've got to roll the tyres so the weight of this vehicle doesn't sit on the same bit of rubber for too long. To do that, you need drivers, you need fuel, and you get given fuel. Now, if you're a local Russian military commander, you can do one or two things with that fuel. You can put it in the vehicles.
Or sell it.
And drive the vehicles around, or you can sell it. And what we now know is all those pictures of where the tyres have come off. These vehicles haven't been shot at. They haven't hit mines. The rubber on the tyres had perished and had come off the wheels. And the vehicles were stuck. And all the spare tyres were just as corroded as the tyres on the vehicles. So that's why they got stuck. And that is a key indicator that the fuel had been stolen and sold on the black market. So ineptitude, corruption, all these things were endemic in the Russian military. Massive lack of leadership. Army officers who just didn't know how to lead. So they were pointing guns at their own troops, going, go that way towards the Ukrainians or I'm going to shoot you. And I don't know if any of you are in the kind of OTC or think about the career in the military. Word of advice, pointing guns at your own soldiers is not as motivating as you might think. And the Russian military was not ready. They have got better. They have got better. Russia's turned its economy onto a war footing. Now, you can only do that very long. Russia's economy is about the size of Portugal. And the Ukrainian military have learnt very, very quickly. They got very good very quickly. And the fact that they've held the Russian military to a standstill for the last 2 years, basically, 18 months, 2 years, where there's almost no ground moving one way or the other, is, I think, a minor miracle. And it's been done with support from the US, from the UK, from other countries, and a whole load of training. But mainly, what we are reminded of is when people are fighting for their own country, in their own country, they fight really, really, really hard. And that's not about technology, that's not about scale or industry, it's about how passionate people are. And I've had the opportunity to meet some of the Ukrainians that trained in the UK on a thing called Operation Interflex, where NATO allies were training Ukrainians to fight in the front line, and everyone from 18-year-olds to people well into their 40s. And when we first set up this training program, we were really worried that we would have basically deserters, because they're being sent from Ukraine to the UK, being trained in the UK, and we thought they would just run away, not go back. Perhaps rather, buying into some racial cliches, we thought there'd be a big problem with drinking. We thought that there'd be a problem motivating these people. I went, when I was Foreign Secretary, I went to visit the training unit, and I spoke to the brigadier that was head of the training team. And I said, how is it? How are these things? And he said, our biggest problem is making them stop training and go to bed. He said, we've had no disciplinary issues. Thousands of Ukrainians have come through, they've had no disciplinary issues. They've had no issues with drinking, they've had no issues with theft, they've had no issues with desertion, the kind of things you would normally find. He said the biggest problem is to say, look, pace yourself. Don't try and learn everything on day one. They are so passionate and so motivated because they're fighting for their homeland.
Does Putin now think that this is an existential question for him? Can he survive politically the kind of settlement that you described earlier?
I think him surviving politically is the least of his worries. Him surviving. And look, I don't know. Short answer is I don't know. I don't see the reporting anymore. I don't have my, I used to, I don't want to sound cool and kind of mysterious, but I used to get direct reporting from our intelligence agencies. Because I was, as the UK Foreign Secretary, you are ultimately the minister responsible for both the work of MI6 and GCHQ, which is our equivalent of the NSA. So I used to get reporting, which I don't get anymore. So short answer is I don't know. What I suspect is that Putin's political and personal survival is totally interwoven with this ongoing conflict. I think President Trump underestimates that. And I think that's why President Trump keeps being surprised and frustrated that Putin is not willing to do a deal. I suspect the day after this conflict finishes, Putin is going to be worried about assassination attempts internally, because this finishes when Russia fails in its invasion of Ukraine. Until they fail in their invasion of Ukraine, it isn't finished. When it is finished, it's obvious that those lives, that money, have all been wasted by Putin, and there are a bunch of very rich, very powerful, very sinister Russians whose wealth is now tied up in frozen assets around the world, whose lifestyles have been curtailed, who can't go skiing in Courchevel.
Can't own a football team.
Can't own football teams in the UK, and they're going to be really, really, really frustrated. And Putin cannot blame anyone other than himself, and they won't blame anyone other than him. So once this conflict is finished, things get politically and personally, I think, very, very, very difficult for Putin. So he doesn't have a personal incentive to bring this war to a conclusion. And I think that's where the White House, I think, can't quite understand. Like you've got a good deal, and I don't know the details of what they've been negotiating, but you keep hearing things coming out of the White House with President Trump or Secretary Rubio, basically saying, we're nearly there, we're making, et cetera, sounding quite positive. Then everything goes quiet all of a sudden, and then the next thing you know is President Trump saying, this guy should do a deal, Putin should do a deal, and like getting angry with Putin, because Putin is rejecting all the White House attempts to bring this to a conclusion. And I think it's because, genuinely, Putin gets to be in a very, very dangerous position when this is finished.
That reminds me of what happened to Nikita Khrushchev after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It didn't happen suddenly, but within a year, they deposed him and said, how could you have, A, gotten us into this mess in the first place, and B, how could you have surrendered and basically given in? And they threw him out.
Yeah, and look, the Russian people have always gravitated to all these kind of strongman leaders, whether it was in the Tsarist era or the communist era or the post-communist era. I mean, you can change the branding on the bottle, but the drink inside is fundamentally the same, which is a very centralized power base, a strongman power base in Moscow, with tentacles reaching out across like Russia and the bordering countries. That has always been the Russian model. When that strongman image gets dented, then what's your sales pitch? If you're the strong man who isn't strong, you're going to be replaced by someone who is. And again, that has got to be in the back of President Putin's mind.
Okay, we talked about Ukraine. Let me go back to something you said at the beginning. Britain, which has nuclear weapons, you suggest needs to spend more on defense. How would that fit with all the other competing demands on the exchequer, like the National Health Service?
So I think we need to recognize what's important. Now, the National Health Service is incredibly important. My mother worked in the National Health Service. My mother's from West Africa. She came to the UK in the early 1960s. She worked in the National Health Service the whole way through her life. I've always been treated by the National Health Service. My wife, Susie, has been treated through the National Health Service. Both my sons were born in a National Health Service hospital. It is, it's the closest the UK has to a state religion. But it can spend money really wastefully. It's breathtaking. It can do amazing stuff, but it can squander money like you wouldn't believe. And we've seen examples of where you see wasteful spending, and that's replicated all over the place. Our social protection system, our welfare bill, has spiraled out of control post-COVID. And we've had this weird situation where suddenly people are getting subsidised cars, heavily subsidised cars, paid for by the state, paid for by the British government, because they have mild depression. And that's being written. The doctors are writing sick notes for all kinds of stuff. So some elements of public spending have spiraled out of control. And even the Labour government, and quite a left-wing government in the UK, attempted to squeeze the benefits budget, but their backbenchers wouldn't let them. So the executive was overruled by their backbenchers. And so they've recognised the problem, they just failed to deal with it. So we have to reorientate some of our spending. Our social protection program is very, very dear to us. It's something which we're not going to undo. Conservative politicians in the UK, we have an appetite to reduce the proportion of the government expenditure taken up by these things and reduce the totality of that expenditure. But nobody is talking about dismantling the NHS or the British welfare state, but it does need to be brought under control. And look, I'm a pretty right-wing Brit, and I know British politics doesn't track perfectly with American politics, but I'm a low-tax, small-state conservative. And one of the things I think, need to do in the UK is recognise the government needs to do a lot less. Just needs to do less stuff. Because at the moment, particularly again post-COVID, the government has become really sprawling, very greedy in its activity, very intrusive, and very, very inefficient. And I'm conscious that a big chunk of that happened on our watch as Conservatives. And we got punished at the ballot box in 2024. We got kicked out of government, our worst election result in the history of my party. And we got to own that, and we got to do things different next time. But the world has become a much more dangerous place. So whilst the overall spending envelope has got to come down, certain areas like defence has got to go up. And balancing those things is not going to be easy, and it's going to take some tough, and when a politician says tough, what we mean is unpopular decisions.
So do you see those decisions being made in Britain before the next election? Do you see them being made in France and Germany?
So let's start with the UK. I think our Prime Minister, I don't know how much the audience have been keeping track of what's going on in the UK. It seemed that I left the UK to come here as a visiting fellow at the University of Southern California. Great school, by the way. And pretty much as soon as I left, the Labour government started falling apart, which I don't think is my fault, but
I think Peter Mandelson might have had something to do with it.
Peter Mandelson might have had something to do with it. So our Prime Minister is in a very, very, very weak position. He has got a huge majority. So theoretically, he should be able to do a huge amount. A British Prime Minister with a large working majority is a much more powerful politician than most people realise. Probably more powerful than the US President. You don't have to, you can set budgets. There are loads of things where you've got the royal prerogative, decisions you can just make. They don't have to be signed off by the Houses of Parliament. You can do an awful lot.
Can I interrupt? I'm always fascinated when I listen to the budget. The Chancellor says, from 6 p.m. tonight, the rate of duty on X will be cut by...
Yeah, you can just say it. And again,
it happens.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I was talking to someone about some proposed changes to the NHS. The details doesn't really matter. And they were asking me, an American friend, they were saying, so how does that happen? And I said, okay, well, the health secretary comes to the House of Commons, leans on the dispatch box, and then says it, and it's read into the record, and then it kind of happens. And they said, yeah, but what mechanism? I went, that is the mechanism. The mechanism is you say it out loud, is read into the record, you then go back to the Department of Health, and you tell the officials, you move money, we can move massive chunks of money around the British governmental system, and the Houses of Parliament, the Commons and the Lords, have actually very, very little power. Theoretically, they have the power to veto budgets, but as I say, because of the funny way our system is made up, because the legislature is interwoven with the executive, and you only get to be the executive because you have a majority in the legislature. When the executive wants to do it, it kind of just happens because you've already got the inbuilt votes in the legislature.
If you watch what happens after the chancellor's done presenting the budget,
Yeah.
people walk through the voting lobbies,
Yeah.
and all of one party, the majority party, walks
Yeah.
through one lobby.
Yeah. And also, if you don't, you're chucked out the party. So voting against the King's speech. So the King's speech sets out the government's agenda. You have a couple of days of debate, and then you vote on the King's speech. If you are in the governing party and you vote against the King's speech, you are kicked out of the party, like that. If you're in the governing party and you vote against the budget, you are kicked out of the party, like that. You can go off-piste on other votes, but on the King's speech and the budget vote, it is a hard 3-line whip. And it's a hanging offence, pretty much.
So do we have to wait for another government before Britain invests more and more in national defence?
I think so, because the Prime Minister said he wants to, but every time he tries to do anything to free up the money to make it happen, his backbenchers don't let him. And the thing is, it doesn't even come to a vote, because you know I said you vote against the budget, you get kicked out of the party. If you want the budget to be different and you don't want to get kicked out of the party, you go up to your whip quietly in one of the corridors and you basically say, I'm not voting for that. And if enough of your colleagues say that, then you don't need to actually vote against it because the government changes position. This has happened a couple of times now, and they just haven't got the money. They haven't got the money to do half the things they say they want to do. So this Labour Party is in a really difficult place. It's become the most unpopular government in British history, and it's done it in 18. It took us 14 years to be really unpopular. And the Labour Party have gone, hold my beer, you know. It took you 14 years, 14 months. And now we've got this crazy situation where a Labour Prime Minister that's got the largest majority that Labour have ever had in its history is on the verge of being deposed by an internal coup. And
which today seems less likely, I think, than yesterday. With the whole cabinet rallying behind the Prime Minister.
That's right. So over the weekend, I thought the Prime Minister might be gone by Valentine's Day. I still think so we have local government elections in May, the closest we've got to midterms. And unless something miraculous happens with the British public mood, the Labour Party, I mean, we'll have a tough time from Conservatives because we've got a multi-party system. Just because Labour are doing badly doesn't mean we'll do well. I think the British Conservative Party will have a tough time in those elections, but I think the Labour Party will have a catastrophic time. And if I were a would-be Labour leader, I would want Keir Starmer to carry the can for that, then get rid of him, and then be the new face, rather than being the new face and your first week at work being a really bad set of local election results.
So I'm going to leave this in a minute, but how about France and Germany?
So France and Germany, France and Germany both had recent elections where centrist, sensible people have been elected. And it's really, if all you look at is the headlines, you will go, oh, European politics is in a really good place. Scratch below the headlines, what you'll find is European politics, and this is true in the UK and in a lot of other countries as well, is being really polarized. There's been a real bifurcation. So in France, President Macron was re-elected. He's a sensible guy. As I say, he's quite a showman. I've had the chance to meet him on a number of occasions. He's very smart, he's very charming. You can see why he upended the French political system to become president in the first place. But he was run really close by a neo-fascist. A neo-fascist nearly won the French presidential elections in the runoff, in the final two. And Le Pen wasn't even the most right-wing candidate on the original French ticket. So France has got some real issues. In Germany, again, CDU, sensible, centre centre-right, became chancellor, cobbled together this weird kind of rainbow coalition of sensible political parties. But AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, very, very nativist, quite racist, hard-right party, did very, very well. And Die Linke, a quite nativist, hard-left party, also did very well. And Die Linke and AfD kind of cancelled each other out in the coalition negotiations, and Germany ended up with actually a very sensible, thoughtful chancellor. But that disguises the fact that German politics is really being pulled apart. That's being replicated in a lot of other countries around Europe, and I think that this polarization in politics is playing out here in the US as well. So the question that I think all of us in mature democracies, Northern Hemisphere mature democracies, Canada, US, Australia, I was talking to Tony Abbott a few days ago, former Prime Minister of Australia. Again, we're seeing the same polarization in Australian politics. So all the mature democracies around the world are experiencing this hyperpolarization all at the same time. And the question we got to ask ourselves is, what is the real driver for this polarization? Is it a blip or is it the new normal? And if you don't like it, what do you do about it? How do you compete?
Why don't you answer those three questions?
Well, look, mate, if I could do that, if I could do that.
Or take a stab at it.
Okay, look, I think we've got to realize that when people are angry and scared, it's not good enough just to tell them off for being angry and scared. I think it's a really, really bad habit. I've seen this in the US, I've seen this in the UK post the Brexit vote, where people who have said that things are not working for me, and the response to that cri de coeur is the political establishment saying, "Shut up, you racist idiot," which is never the most winning formula to get these people to vote for you. But that's kind of the tone that came across. What happened when people voted for President Trump in 2016? A whole load of people went, "Oh, the Americans have gone crazy. Americans have turned into these racist, nasty, crazy people." And they started blaming the American people for voting for the wrong president. In Brexit, again in 2016, a whole load of British people voted to leave the European Union. The message that came flooding out of Westminster and Brussels and international commentariat is the Britons have turned into this nasty, racist little island, introspective nation. And we started blaming the voters. The voters are never wrong. If you believe in democracy, you have to believe the voters are never wrong. And if they are telling you something, if they're saying, "I am worried about large-scale immigration, particularly large-scale illegal immigration. I am worried that I can't get on the housing ladder, my kids can't get on the housing ladder. I'm worried that my job that relied on skillfulness is being downgraded and discarded because I'm never going to wear a suit and work in front of a computer, and you're telling me there isn't a future for me or for my kids or for people like me." If people are telling you that and you're not listening, they will go and find someone that does listen, or at least pretends to listen. And for me, this is where populist politics comes. I think this is both the real appeal of populist politics, but also the poison that is in the heart of populist politics. Because people turn around and say, "What are you angry about?" "Yeah, I agree with you." "What about you? You angry at something?" "Oh yeah, I reflect the anger." "What about you? You're angry at him?" "Yeah, I'm angry at him as well." "Don't tell him, I just told him I'm on his side, but I'm angry with him as well." And you harvest anger all over the place. And then you say, if you're angry with X and I'm angry with X, I get you, you should vote for me. Now that's great until you then have to deal with something. And if you've been harvesting and amplifying anger, and then you fail to deliver, as inevitably you will, then you've stoked up a fire, and that conflagration will consume you and everybody else. And this is, I think, as I say, the poison that is at the heart of populist politics. So, if you don't want that to happen, you've got to be solutions focused. You've actually got to come up with ways of dealing with stuff. The problem with that is it's never sexy. And you're always going to be outbid by someone saying, what's he talking about? Well, he's talking about maybe like reducing taxes a bit here, but not as much as you would like, or doing this, but not as much, actually you're going to try and do this, but he's not going to, he's not going to do this thing. I'd be willing to go further. Well, he's going to burn some red tape in Washington or at Sacramento or in Westminster. Well, I'm not going to burn red tape. I'm going to burn the whole thing down and everyone in there. I'm going to shoot them if they look at you funny. And people are like, well, this guy sounds more exciting. So how do you compete with someone who can always outbid you with tone and language and hyperbole, which is great for winning elections, really bad for governing? And this is where at the moment I genuinely don't know the answer. Because if you keep chasing the white rabbit down the populist hole, then when you win an election, you're just amplifying the problem that created the populism. We got voted out of office, my contention as Conservatives, because the gap between our rhetoric and our delivery got too big. And I don't think that is solved by having an even bigger gap between rhetoric and delivery. I think that is an unsustainable solution. But we've got to find a way of making pragmatic, thoughtful, deliverable politics as sexy and exciting as populist politics.
Okay, I promise I'll get back to foreign affairs before we're done, but I'm fascinated by this. We didn't live in that kind of democratic world up until 10, 15 years ago. What's happened? Is it a giant failure of globalization?
I think a lot of things. Have happened simultaneously. I do think the internationalization, globalization of a whole load of economic activity is part of it. The UK deindustrialized through the 80s and 90s.
Right.
So we stopped being a major player in heavy industry. Coal mining largely stopped, shipbuilding largely stopped, motor manufacturing reduced massively. We became a very service industry culture. So we became very, very high value add with a very high proportion of people that wear suits to work and sit at a computer and wear braces like Gordon Gekko. And you don't know who Gordon Gekko is, do you? Okay. I won't explain. It's on YouTube. You do know what YouTube is. That's still a thing? That's still a thing.
YouTube, just think of him as a modern day robber baron.
Yeah. So we went very far down that route. But we recognized in the 2016 Brexit vote that a lot of the communities that used to have heavy industry as their heart and soul and their identity as well as their economic driver had never really recovered from that deindustrialization. And those jobs went to other countries. So that is part of it. I do think the nature of modern media, the modern social media and broadcast media as well, I think the news has been dumbed down dramatically. I keep seeing news items where the anchor, the news reporters, are telling the audience how they personally feel about news items. And I'm like, we're the best one in the world. I don't care how you feel. I want to know what's happening. I want to know what people are doing about it. I don't care that you feel terribly upset by these images of whatever they might be, because you're not, you're the TV anchor. Yeah, there's so much of feels. And the other thing is I think the hyper fragmentation of information and knowledge. So on Sunday, I sat with a group of people and we watched the Super Bowl. Mass participation, media consumption event. And the adverts on the Super Bowl are the adverts seen by everybody watching the Super Bowl right the way across the United States of America. Other than the Super Bowl, I don't know how many other mass participation media consumption events there are anymore. And so everything becomes fragmented, geographically, demographically. You know, so you're a certain demographic, you're only watching streaming services, your media consumption is tailored to wealthy, middle class, perhaps suburban. If you're more rural, you'll maybe get like local traditional broadcast rather than streaming service. Your news might be one of the like Fox News affiliates, so your news consumption is skewed in that way. So you're watching news in this house, and a 2-hour drive away, same state, maybe same county, and if it's in LA, it might even be the same neighborhood, 2-hour drive. But you're consuming fundamentally different things. And if you're going online, that is even more the case. So in this apartment, I'm looking at footage from where is it, Wisconsin, Milwaukee? Where are the ice things going on? And Minneapolis. And I'm looking at that and I'm horrified by the images. And in the apartment next door to me, because they're consuming news perhaps on their phone, through social media, peer-to-peer news items, they're not seeing any of that imagery at all, and they are seeing news reports of some terrible crime that's been perpetrated by a recent immigrant. Next door to each other, and their views are being steered in fundamentally different directions. They are demographically identical, but they are being pulled apart in terms of their attitudes, views, and beliefs. And there's no shared point of, there's no commonality. There's no shared truth from which they can take legitimately different positions, but they're not even looking at the same picture and making a judgment call. They're looking at fundamentally different pictures. And then when they meet, dropping the kids off at school, and one of them says, you know what, I don't think ICE are going far enough. This is ridiculous. They should go much, much harder. And the person next to them like, what, are you kidding me? Like, what kind of fascist are you? And two reasonable and thoughtful people that have been trained by the algorithms to have fundamentally different views. And views which are so fundamentally different, they're not even really speaking the same language anymore. And that can't be good for democracy, because democracy is about, it has to be about not common positions, but it has to be about
common knowledge base.
Yeah, common knowledge base. Yeah, sorry, I've ranted a little bit on that one because I think I was about to say it keeps me awake at night. That's not quite true. I sleep pretty well, but
no, I think it's fundamental.
But it's
in
really
1960, people didn't have much other choice than to watch the Kennedy-Nixon presidential debate. The viewership for that is way down now for these debates in a country where the population is way up.
Yeah.
Because people have many other choices.
But even selective editing, I mean, you could have a debate, and depending on your news channel of choice or your social media feed of choice, you know, if I pick the couple of questions where my favorite candidate has a real slam dunk answer, and I splice it together with a whole load of B-roll of the other candidate kind of like doing that and rubbing their chin and, you know, getting something out their eye and like looking at their notes and like scrunching their face because they didn't quite hear the question from the audience because the microphone hadn't got to the audience member yet. I can make one candidate look like a titan, and I can make the other candidate look like a minnow. Nothing to do with the actual answers and questions.
But in 60, you watched the whole thing.
Exactly.
It wasn't spliced.
Exactly. And that's why, again, you know, people bump into each other and say, oh, did you see the debate last night? Yeah, John Doe, oh my God, that guy's, he's just got all the answers. He just knows everything. And someone else is like, are you kidding me? The guy's an idiot. He couldn't even string a sentence together. And someone says, hey, were we even watching the same debate? And the answer is yes, but actually no. That's a problem.
One other domestic issue, and then I have a couple final foreign policy questions. You were Home Secretary. You had to deal with the difficulties of immigration, people coming across the channel in boats. And immigration has been a very intense issue here in the U.S.
Yeah.
How can Western societies, from Britain to France to Germany to the U.S., deal with this in a rational and humane way?
Yeah. So I think to really understand why this is such an issue in the UK, you have to remind yourself the UK is an island nation. And that has a much, much more powerful effect on your collective character and psyche than I think continental peoples, I think, don't always get their head around that. So, for example, if you're in, if you're German, if you're in Germany, you can literally walk into Germany from a whole load of other countries. So Germany doesn't secure its borders at its borders. Germany, like a lot of other continental European countries, does its border control via ID cards at the point of interaction with the state. So if you want to rent a car, if you want to rent an apartment or a house or something like that, if you want to use medical facilities, that's where you have to prove that you're entitled to do that. In the UK, our assumption and our systems are kind of geared up to say, if you're physically in the country, you're probably meant to be here, because there's like 26 miles of salty water between us and the nearest next country. So our systems tended to be robust at the border and actually very permissive within the country, which is great until, crossing the border, crossing the channel became technically quite easy. Most illegal migrants into the UK do not arrive by small boats. They overstay visas, they come in trucks, they do other things. The reason the small boats are so iconic, it's because we're an island. And it just feels weird that someone can get on a boat, a slow-moving, flimsy rubber dinghy, and bob across the waves for at least 26 miles in the full view of all the British authorities. And when they get to the halfway point, rather than think, well, let's just watch them for the next 13 miles, what our RNLI, nearly the equivalent of the Coast Guard, it's like, well, look, we might as well pluck them out of the water here because they're going to end up in the UK. So they get on the boats, they get onto our British flagged vessels, get taken to the UK, and then we start the process of processing them and attempting to deport them, which we're not very good at. It's not something we've had to do very much because we've always been relatively difficult to get to. So a whole load of governmental systems that we're just not as good at. Most European countries are better at deporting people than we are. And I think one of the other challenges that we've got is our judicial system has become very, very permissive. We've taken a very, 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 I think, extremist interpretation of the UN Convention on, the European Convention on Human Rights, which basically means that as soon as someone's...
Which I think Britain largely wrote.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. It was our baby. It was a Churchill. He was one of the real drivers behind that. But it's like a lot of things. I think it's evolved way beyond where it should be, and it's now being used as an excuse. I had a situation. I won't go into the details. I had a situation where a violent sexual criminal that was in the UK illegally had regularly broken the law. The UK government was trying to deport them, back to another country with a well-established rule of law, a good judicial system, a Commonwealth judicial system, and they put in an application to say, risk of persecution. And my response was like, oh, don't be daft. But the judicial response was, yeah, you should let this sexual predator stay in the UK because they might be a bit nasty to him in the country that he originally came from.
So how do we solve this?
I think we need to take a big reality pill. I ask myself
you referred to ISIS, and I think if you look at the polling, 2/3 of Americans are horrified by the stuff they saw in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. So doing more and more and more of that doesn't seem to be the solution.
Yeah, and I think that the point you make about doing it humanely, the question I ask myself is, has the UK suddenly turned into a vicious, nasty, racist country? And for me, the answer is a compelling no. I was the international face of the UK. I'm half African, half English. My Prime Minister at the time was Indian heritage. The Trade Secretary at the time was African heritage. The Chancellor was African heritage. In fact, at one point, the top 4 jobs in the British political establishment, you had the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary. So basically, the Prime Minister, the money guy, the Home Affairs guy, the Foreign Affairs guy. Those 4 big jobs. Only one of them was held by someone who was ethnically British. And the British people didn't care. Absolutely, hardly even noticed. So we are not a nasty racist country. And my argument is, if I, as Home Secretary, am saying this has gone too far, we are losing legitimacy in the eyes of the British people. If a government cannot even decide who does and does not have the right to live in a country, then the people of that country will say, well, hang on a second, if you can't even get the basics right, if I can see you're failing on this, how on earth am I meant to believe that the things that I can't see you're also doing right? Because if you say, oh, look, border control isn't working, but trust me, we're all over it with regard to the health service, they're like, no, I don't think it's true. I studied hotel and catering management at university, which is quite unusual in the British political system. I did not go to Oxford or Cambridge. I didn't study economics or law or history. I studied hotel and catering management. And there's a phrase that I was once told about the catering industry, which was, people in a restaurant can't inspect the cleanliness of the kitchens, but they do get to use the toilets, the restrooms, for sensitive American. If the restrooms are dirty, they know the kitchens are dirty, even though they can't inspect the kitchens. So people will extrapolate from the thing they can see and apply it to the things they can't see. So if you are failing on the visible bits of government, voters assume you are failing in every bit of government. And this is why the small boats was such an issue. Because I and my predecessor and my predecessor's predecessor kept saying, we've got to stop this, because it's a very visible inability of us to deliver government. And if we are not seen to be successful there, when we say, oh, by the way, our spies are really good at spying, only you can't see it. And our finance people are really good at finance, only you can't see it. And the voters will turn around and go, no, I think you're bullshitting me. Because the thing I can see you're not getting right, I'm going to assume you're not getting anything else right. And that's why we got kicked out of government. And that's now why Labour is such a problem. Because they got elected on a promise to be not the Tories.
Your catering analogy is fascinating, because I happen to know from someone who advises them, McDonald's is absolutely fanatical about the cleanliness of the bathrooms.
Yeah.
And they send inspectors around all the time who don't identify themselves.
Yeah.
And if a franchisee is keeping a dirty bathroom,
yeah.
they're not going to keep their franchise.
And it works both literally and metaphorically. And this is where looping back to the whole populism thing, we've got to get back into the habit of proving to the people that vote us that we are discharging our duty professionally. So I've spent the time I've been here in California and in LA looking at housing, which I know this is international relations, but I think there's a lot of disenchantment with Californians, and particularly Los Angelinos. Is that the right word?
Yes.
About housing, because it's something that touches absolutely everybody. And the governors, the governor, mayors, state officials can turn around and say, no, we've got this. We're all over this. Trust me, it's fine. And people in LA are like, yeah, but housing costs like 5 times as much as anywhere else in the country. I think you're doing it wrong. And if you're doing this wrong, I'm assuming you're doing everything else wrong. Which might be deeply unfair, but like that's politics. And we have to respond to that. We have to regain the confidence of our voters.
This was supposed to be about foreign policy. We got off track a little, but I think we're really on track.
My bad.
Because you know why? It reflects the nature of the British system. You could be the foreign secretary, you could be the home secretary.
Yeah.
People in Parliament can hold very different jobs across a range of years. So let me loop back to foreign policy.
Sure.
The Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was issued by, there's debate, the British government or a British cabinet minister on his own, opened the way for the establishment more than 30 years later of the State of Israel. At least since the 1990s, British governments, most US administrations, Western countries in general, and even a number of the Arab countries, privately or publicly, have favored a two-state solution, with Israel living alongside some form of independent Palestinian state. At this point, that project seems increasingly remote. So do you think there's a plausible diplomatic path back to a two-state solution? And more fundamentally, what's the alternative to it?
Well, let me work backwards through that question, because sometimes when you can't see a route to an end state, you need to ask yourself, is that end state genuinely something that's worth pursuing? And I've had this conversation with people that I know in the senior leadership of Israel, and I've had this conversation with senior Palestinian leadership, more on the West Bank than in Gaza, for obvious reasons. But I've said a two-state solution is the only sustainable answer. And to my Palestinian friends and contacts, I've said, when Palestinian people or their supporters internationally talk about from the river to the sea, you'll talk about eradicating the state of Israel. That's not going to happen. Israel is not going anywhere. It is too well established, it is too wealthy, it is too powerful, it is too militarily successful. You are not going to eradicate the state of Israel. So stop saying that that's what you want, because it's not going to happen.
How about on the other side?
And I said to the Israelis, no, let me finish the point with the Palestinians. So I've said, you want a Palestinian nation. Your Palestinian nation has got to live side by side with Israel, because the only other way of having a Palestinian nation is if Israel doesn't exist. Those are the two options. So 3 options. 1, a Palestinian state does not exist. That's one option. Option 2, a Palestinian state lives next door to an Israeli state. Or option 3, a Palestinian state occupies the whole of the region that currently is occupied by Israel. That third one is not going to happen. So pick one of the other 2. Either Palestine doesn't exist or it exists next door to Israel. Those are your only 2 credible options. That's what I say to my Palestinian friends. What I say to my Israeli friends is, you are proud of being a Jewish democracy, but the birth rate of Arab Israelis, Muslim Israelis, and despite talks of it being an apartheid state or whatever, there are plenty of Muslim Israelis, including in the Knesset, elected Muslims. And the birth rate of Muslim, Arab Israelis tends to be higher than either secular or Jewish Israelis. And I've said to my Israeli friends, look, if Israel becomes the only state between the river and the sea, you're going to import a significant number of ethnically Palestinian Muslim Israelis who have shown to have a higher birth rate than you. And so eventually, you all have to make a choice. Do you want to stay Jewish, or do you want to stay a democracy? Because eventually, maths will mean you can't do both. And if you want to stay a Jewish democracy, then you need a Palestinian state living next door to your Israeli state. So whether you're a Palestinian or an Israeli, the thing that you should want can only be delivered by a two-state solution. And the reason I gave that a bit of time is because the outcome is compelling. Back to the first half of the question, how do we get there? That is really, really, really hard. And like a lot of really difficult questions like that, it will take leadership in both Israel and the Palestinian territories to recognize that they have collective interest in a two-state solution. And at the moment, there are too many voices in the Israeli system that genuinely think that a greater Israel can exist between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And they're trying to push for that. They're in the minority, but they're there. And there's too many voices in the Palestinian territories, sadly a majority, that are quite happy to eradicate the state of Israel. And until that changes, then we're going to have conflict. But the bottom line is that, and this is why I'm so passionate about a two-state solution, is I can't see, it's a Nash equilibrium. Any mathematicians in the room? No? Okay. Nash equilibrium. Anyway, again, look it up. The Nash equilibrium, it is a point in a negotiation, part of game theory. It's a point in negotiation where no further move can benefit either player in the game. The Nash equilibrium is a two-state solution. And anything that is not a two-state solution is not equilibrium and is ultimately unsustainable. And once you've got your head around that reality, then how you get there doesn't become easier, but becomes inevitable.
One of the things I think that has reduced support in Israel for a Palestinian state, even one that's only mildly armed, 10-year transition, however you do it, is that both in 2000, Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak, and then in 2007, the British government and Ehud Olmert came up with plans that would have created a Palestinian state on, you can debate it, 95 to 98% of the territory, with representation of maybe a capital in East Jerusalem and control over the top of the Temple Mount. Yeah. And the Palestinians rejected it.
I've had this conversation with Palestinians. I've said, you need to say yes to a deal, because every time you say no to a deal, the deal gets worse. And if you know that to be, that's just...
Well, that's Bill Clinton said.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton said, hey, Yasser Arafat, you just turned down the best deal you're ever going to get.
Yeah. And I've said, genuinely, I've had this with very senior leadership in very senior Palestinian leadership. I said, you've got to recognize your pattern of behavior, your revealed preference, which is a deal gets put in front of you. You say no to that deal, we want a better deal. Then what happens is a deal gets put in front of you which is worse than the deal that you just had. And then you say, no, we want that other deal you showed us. And then the world says, that deal's gone and is never coming back. And then the Palestinian people say, let me have a look at the next deal. And then they start the beginning of the cycle again. And they have kept watching through settler expansion, which I am not comfortable with at all. The West Bank being nibbled away like a Swiss cheese. So there's now it's, unless there are meaningful land swaps, you're not going to get a contiguous West Bank Palestinian state. See, the behavior of Hamas in Gaza, both to the Gazan people and to the Israelis, totally unacceptable, which is creating a degree of distrust, not just within Israel, but also with neighboring Arab countries, which is making a tenable Gaza harder and harder to recognise. And I've said it's easy for me to say, and I've had some very heated discussions with Palestinian contacts, to say as difficult as it might be, as politically difficult as it might be to sell to the Gazan people, you have got to say yes to something, because the deals just keep getting worse for you. And you can moan about it and say how unfair it is, but this was not only predictable, but it indeed was predicted. I was at the fringes of COP26. Which one was in Glasgow anyway? John Kerry was talking to a senior representative from the Palestinian Authority, and you could see how frustrated he was. You could see how frustrated he was that this fell apart.
Yeah, on the last day of his presidency, Yasser Arafat called Bill Clinton and said, "I want to thank you and congratulate you. You are a great man." And Bill Clinton said, "I was going to be a great man. You stopped me from being a great man." So I thought we'd open this up for a minute or two, 10 minutes maybe, to questions. So anybody have, please do not make a speech. You're going to ask a question, ask a question. Anyone in the audience?
The first one's normally the hardest one, and then you get a real flood of questions.
Rob.
You can whine about it and keep saying how unfair it is, or you can be practical. I think I got that right.
That's about right.
Talking about Ukraine and Russia, or Israel and Palestine. Could the same be said about the Ukrainian situation because of the gradient of force of economics, that as bad as it is, it's going to be worse in 6 months and 6 months more as Russia keeps pushing forward?
Well, the thing is, Russia isn't pushing forward. Russia's in a stalemate, and I think the Ukrainian position is more sustainable than the Russian position. Ultimately, the full might of the Russian military got thrown at Ukraine. And if you look at the bits of Ukraine that had been kind of softly annexed by Russia anyway, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, a few other bits around Odessa or towards Odessa. In terms of military gains, battlefield gains, Russia's hardly moved the line of contact at all. And they have burnt through hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers to gain almost nothing. Ukraine is uninvadable. It's just too big. And it's got a massive river down the middle, a marshy banked river down the middle, and you're not going to fight your way across that. An opposed river crossing is the best way of turning young men and women into corpses. And so basically, line of contact's not going to shift. And Putin's not going to be around indefinitely. And the Russians' appetite for economic and social hardship is not infinite. And if Russia wasn't going to win quickly, or relatively quickly, they weren't going to win. So whilst I do get the whole kind of pragmatism thing on this, the bottom line is the difference, I would say, between the situation with the Palestinian state, the situation with Ukraine, is Putin has never made a credible offer. His offer has been, let me keep all the land that I've occupied and some more, and in return, No, that's it. and Zelensky's like, no, that's a bad deal. And so I don't think there has been a credible offer. And I think this is why the White House has been very frustrated with Putin, because he keeps rejecting what, now, I'm not sure I would agree that they were reasonable concessions, but I think the White House, and again, I'm not over the details, so I don't want to speculate too much, but I think the White House have put forward what they have felt were credible concessions. Putin keeps rejecting them because he doesn't want a reasonable solution. He wants a big win. That is totally unacceptable for Zelensky, and that's why you got this stalemate.
Someone else? Yes, sir.
Really appreciate your pragmatic approach, but I've got a question about sort of populism and what you're saying about the need to agree upon language relative to truth. I teach across the road at UCLA sociology. I've got a colleague.
Brave man coming onto campus.
Okay. I teach in sociology, and I have a colleague who sort of talks about populism being sort of framed as thinking about Christianism, for example, related to religion, which is sort of this phenomena that's devoid of the content of Christianity. Right? Now, you mentioned a few things about religion, NHS being the sort of closest thing we have to state religion. Of course, there is an established religion.
Yeah.
One of the 2 countries in the world that has it. But, you know, you did start to emphasize, I think, you know, Islam towards the end, and Judaism, and sort of, it seems like with some of these key issues, you were highlighting religion, but I'm just wondering if you might not, especially related to the Transatlantic Alliance and the role that religion plays in societal and personal values, if that might not be something that you may be overlooking a bit.
It's an interest. I mean, you're right. We are one of the few countries in the world with an established state religion. People forget that. So the UK is often thought of as a less religious country than the US, for example. I think in terms of regular attendance at places of worship, we are measurably a less religious country than the US. When I was foreign secretary, a big part of my job was explaining the things that feel normal to us and really abnormal to our friends, often in America. One of the, and I will answer the question, I'm not avoiding, I will promise I'll answer it. 2 things that I had to explain. One was a number of my friends, American friends, just saying, like, what was this whole thing about President Biden sitting like halfway back in the church? I thought he was meant to be like, I thought US America was meant to be a thing. He was like 7 or 8 rows back at the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. And one of the things I had to remind people was he was in the front row of all the countries that weren't burying their Queen that day. 14 countries were burying their head of state. And most people forget that. The Queen was the Queen of the United Kingdom, also the Queen of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Tuvalu, Jamaica, the list goes on. So that was one which people forget. And the other one was the coronation, going to your point about the state religion. I think we are the only country in the world that does basically the inauguration of our head of state in a church with the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, you are in charge of the UK because that is what God wants. And we think that's entirely normal, and most of the rest of the world like, well, we don't do that. Like that's the thing. So we do have religion woven into it, but actually I think David Cameron, who Conyers worked with very, very closely, and I work very, very well, he said about himself, and I think this is a good reflection of the British attitude towards religion. He said, religion is like listening to Radio 4 driving through the Chilterns, which is a set of hills outside London between London and his constituency in Oxfordshire. And he said, it's like listening to Radio 4 whilst driving through the Chilterns. It comes and goes. And that's quite a thing. We are kind of religious, we're not very religious. Obviously, much of our thinking and political philosophy is embedded in Christian values, but we're not particularly vocal about that. I think sometimes we underestimate how religious America is. I think sometimes that can cause a little bit of a disconnect. And whilst we would probably call them British values, we're more comfortable describing them as British values. When you actually scratch below the surface, they are quite traditionally like Church of England Christian values. But yeah, we're never very comfortable. We're never very comfortable saying that. And final point on this thing. So I'm not religious, and I've said publicly I'm an atheist. And I've talked to some American friends of mine, just saying, in U.S. politics, that would end it for you. That would be something you were asked about a lot, and you would often have to overcome that in interviews if you were running for high office in the U.S. Whereas in the UK, really no one cares particularly.
By the way, there are atheists in U.S. politics. They just don't admit it. We time for one last question. Yes.
So I'm a student right now taking up international relations. I was wondering if there's any books you'd recommend to better understand foreign affairs.
The problem is there are loads and loads and loads of really, really good books about foreign affairs. A couple of recommendations. I was the Minister for Middle East, North Africa. There is a book, I can't remember the name of the author, but anyway, there's a book which tells you a lot about the Middle East in the 20th century. It's called A Line in the Sand. It starts with the Sykes-Picot Treaty, carving up the Middle East between France and the UK. So, superficially, it's about the Middle East, and it's a good tool for learning about the Middle East, but it's also about the Anglo-French relationship, which is also quite interesting, and the two run in parallel. So I would start off with that one, A Line in the Sand. Obviously, I would say this, I'm a Brit. Churchill's History of the English-Speaking People, I think is again, it's a history book, but it's not really a history book. It's an international relations book. And what other ones? One last one. A guy called Spike Milligan, British comedian in the 1960s. Hitler, My Part in His Downfall, by Spike Milligan, is a really funny book from the viewpoint of a grassroots soldier in the Second World War, trying to get his head around international relations. It's funny and it's fun. Just take one more, because we've had all guys, and I feel...
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. We're going to have her ask a question. Go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for coming in to speak with us today. I loved your opening remark talking about how you're an optimistic conservative and that the alliance with NATO will continue on. But that being said, throughout the rest of our talk, we were kind of talking about how just state after state, country after country, religion after religion is becoming more and more divided. I was wondering what you think those first steps to a more unified unification look like, just kind of maybe across the world.
What are the first steps to try to overcome the divisions inside all these countries? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we do need to do is recognize how self-indulgent some of our political behavior is. I think we underestimate how competitive the world is. And a lot of the discussions that we have seem to be predicated on our inevitable continued prominence globally. There are a lot of countries who crave what we have got. China, India, lots of African countries, Latin American countries are really, they want the kind of wealth and success that we very much take for granted. I think if we have the humility to say that if we want to maintain the lifestyles that we've got used to, the kind of the choices and freedoms that we kind of take for granted, that actually we need to stop being distracted by self-indulgent things, and we need to take more seriously the fact that we are in a globally competitive environment. I think if we did that, we would realize how wasteful this kind of internal polarization is, and it's much harder to get things done. And if you're rowing with each other rather than pulling forward together, you're going to be overtaken. Which sounds like it's more stick than carrot, but I do think that we do need to recognise that it is self-indulgent, and some of the, for want of a better word, some of the culture wars stuff. It's not a phrase I particularly like, but it's a shorthand. When I was foreign minister, you go to other parts of the world, they would look at some of these really toxic, highly divisive debates that we're having in the US, in the UK, in Europe. And they're like, are you crazy? I mean, genuinely, you're rowing about this nonsense. And when I had this with my friends in the Middle East, they were like, the Chinese delegations come over and they're wooing them, and they're talking about investment, they're talking about partnerships, they're talking about economic growth, they're talking about future, hands together, let's do this. And they're being wooed by China, by India and others. They then look at us, the UK, the US, and we look petulant and distracted and decadent, because we're rowing about things which feel like nonsense. And if the question you're asking yourself is, how do I make sure the people in my country have bread every day, and how do I make sure the people in my country have sustainable energy, or reliable energy, not sustainable, reliable energy, and how do I make sure that my young population have got jobs in an increasingly competitive world? If you're thinking of that, and then you look across to us, and we're rowing about who does or does not use the ladies' toilets, people go, oh, you're not serious. You guys are not serious partners. I'm going to partner with these other guys, because these other guys seem to be concentrating on the right stuff. And that's where I think actually if we pull together and focus on the really, really important stuff, and that's not to diminish the personal experience of anybody, but ultimately we've got to recognise that if we value the things that I think we should value, we should protect them, and the best way of protecting them is making sure we stay competitive over the next 10, 15, 50, 100 years. Because that's not a given. It's not a given. That sounds more negative than I intended to. But as I say, the reason I'm an optimist is because ultimately we do have huge advantages, and we do have a lot of residual goodwill, and there are still lots and lots of countries around the world that want to partner with us, and maintaining the partnerships that we've got. So I think if we don't squander what we've got a lot of tools at our disposal, and I think that's what ultimately what will pull us together. A shared goal and objective is always the best way.
So, Sir James, let me thank you for an insightful, compelling, lively conversation. Let me thank Conyers, the Schwarzenegger Institute, and everybody in this audience who is here, who has joined us virtually, or will hear this on our podcast. So thank you all for being here, and get ready for next year's Super Bowl.
Cheers.
You were great.
Thank you.
You were terrific.